Hello. This will serve as a general introduction to medical ethics or healthcare ethics or biomedical ethics, all of which, as I've said in an earlier context, are by and large synonymous with one another. The idea of a medical ethics or an applied ethics looking at the field of healthcare and medicine is relatively new. It's going to develop in the 1960s and 70s, and it won't be until the late 80s or 90s when you start seeing courses added to university and medical college curriculum that look at and examine. And for a very long time, they're going to be taught just by practitioners in those fields and not experts in ethics. But today, it is just as likely that your instructor, as in the case with me, will be a non medical professional or a philosopher or ethicist. As such, ethics itself belongs to philosophy, that ancient and seminal discipline which grounds most other disciplines which might be studied. A vestige of this, of course, is that if you earn a doctorate, a PhD, you're earning a doctorate in philosophy in most fields. There are some exceptions, but that speaks to the very important point that most disciplines did start out as philosophical, or another way of looking at that is that when you study intensively and for a very long time in a field, you're going to be looking at certain fundamental questions which speak to the very nature of what you're doing. So philosophy can be understood as the love of wisdom in many sense, or the love of knowledge, the accumulation and examination of wisdom and knowledge. What is wisdom? What is knowledge? Well, wisdom is something that we might say is a kind of knowing that has been influenced by our practical world. It's based upon experience. It's a way to understand one's experience as opposed to knowledge, which might be more of a kind of factual accumulation of information about things. So in one way, we can say knowledge is about how the world works, and wisdom might be understanding what that means. Uh, Ethics, as a subdivision of philosophy, examines how humans can make moral assessments or judgments, determining what is a good and what is a bad act or practice. As a judgment, you're going to be using reason for the most part. There are very important considerations about adding to and or even supplanting the notion of reason with other aspects, but we're going to not delve too deeply into that, as this is not a class in normative ethics itself, although we will begin, as you will see, looking at the major normative theories. But that is just an academic exercise to get us to see how each of us belongs to or practices one of those moral theories when we make those kinds of judgments. Well, if we start with this notion that ethics is an applied field, think of it as, or excuse me, medical ethics is applied field. Think of it as similar to what we might call animal rights or environmental ethics or business ethics. So you're taking a discrete area of human action or area of consideration and looking at certain aspects to determine policy or behaviors or outcomes based upon whether you believe them to be or you argue for whether they're good or not. So we're talking about within this context, an act is good if it's something that we would say is ethically permissible, and it's not good if it's ethically impermissible. Now, ethics itself, and excuse me, applied ethics and healthcare ethics is going to focus on the area of medicine, healthcare. Now, this is very broadly construed. We're not just talking about the practice of medicine as what a physician would do, but we're also talking about all the assorted or allied or practical fields of medicine and healthcare. And this can range from epidemiology to sports medicine, from kinesiology to imaging technology, from nursing to speech language pathology, and everything in between. There are research ethics and there are clinical ethics, and we're going to be looking at a variety of these. Typically, the methodology of a course of this sort is to look at what we call casuistry, or to look at cases and then try to reason through or decide how to make those decisions. We will be using some of that, but we're going to also be looking at a lot of other areas. And I think it might behoove us to begin with trying to define what ethics is not. Ethics is not religion, although most people will get their ethical worldview from the religion that they or their parents practice. This is a very common way of getting or learning about ethics. Religion is a field of inquiry dealing with divine and theological aspects, but um, and it usually gives us a way of understanding good or bad behavior. But there are very many cases one could cite, and I'm not going to cite them because they're quite a number, where religious practices may be viewed as unethical. Moreover, most ethical traditions that we find within religion tend to be a particular kind of ethical claims or practices, or at least suggestions, and they tend to be rule based. And there are other forms of ethics. So keep in mind that we're not talking about ethics as religion, although you may, of course, ground your religious belief and your ethical belief from the same source, and that's perfectly fine. So there are Buddhist ethics and Catholic and Jewish and Islamic ethics and every other kind of ethical framework that you can think of allied with a particular religious tradition. Ethics are also not law or legality, and that's a very important consideration too. What is legal may not necessarily be moral, and what is moral may not, unfortunately, always be legal. And this clash between what is right to do and what is the appropriate thing to do within a legal code is very important. Ethics tends to transcend law, so you can well imagine a case where something is legal, but you feel it's a wrong thing to do. And as a result, you're going to make reference to a higher power, as it were. Uh, the idea that law is based on ethics can be misleading in many ways. All right. So keep in mind then that as we go forward and think about ethics and start examining our ethical worldviews, we have to put aside both religion and law. I should offer a caveat emptor, or buyer beware here, that in many cases we'll be looking at very difficult moral issues, many of which you might find disturbing, and you can always just turn off the video if that's the case. But one thing to keep in mind is that when we think about law and ethics, I would advise you always do the legal thing, but you might or ought to do the moral thing occasionally, even if they clash. Right. So, the final thing I want to say about this sort of introductory approach to ethics is why ethics? There are a lot of people who are going to be arguing that, well, morality is just private or relativistic. And most philosophers, including myself, will reject the notion of relativism. It ultimately undermines itself. It's a self contradictory hypothesis, if you will. It's basically a canard. But to look at it seriously for a moment, ethics is going to maintain that. Within a relativist sphere, that right or wrong is relative to a person or society. And you'll see very quickly through a cursory glance of recent global history that that is a problematic position, that cultures have done some very inhumane things, declaring them the right thing to do. To avoid that, we're going to look at the possibility that ethics is grounded in a universalist approach or an objective nature. Now, it may well be the case we're not going to find it. And again, we're not going to go too deeply into that outside of the first few lectures and readings on normative ethical theory, because it falls out of the scope of our practical application of ethics that we're looking at within this context. So we're going to put aside those claims as well. Finally, uh, we have to think about, again, under the rubric of why ethics is, there could very well be, and there's some very interesting research being done in this field about the evolutionary nature of ethics, that it seems to be that we have an inbuilt, as it were, developed ethical sensibility, and that, there might be things that uh, we've evolved to look at. And that may well be the case. And again, we're not going to get into looking at that too clearly. But in the final analysis, what I could say is why ethics is that, well, because those in these fields deem it very important. And just like learning a particular titration technique or range of motion technique or any other kind of thing that you're learning in your chosen healthcare profession, you're doing it because others who've come before you have decided, deemed that it's necessary in order to practice that. And I think, in a way, we can see ethics as falling into that same approach too. Okay, so in future talks, we'll be looking at the moral theories and some other considerations of ethics. Goodbye.